specifically focused on protecting our aquifer. And I want to say how happy that we are as a league to see that the town has actually formed an official committee now on water conservation. So it does feel like we're making some progress on this topic. But tonight we want to talk about inland flooding. And before we start that, I want to thank the panelists who've agreed to speak with you and to thank you for attending this evening. And I want to have a big shout out to Patty Anklem for her technical assistance tonight. Since this is a webinar, you're not going to be able to interact directly with the panelists, but there will be an opportunity to ask questions. And you can do that by entering any questions you have on, if you look on your screen, there should be a Q&A. If you write the questions in there, we'll be monitoring those questions, and there'll be a time for presenters to answer at the end. Also want to point out that this is being recorded and it will be posted on the League's website after we've completed our webinar. So now I have the privilege to introduce Joanne Zygmunt from the Old Colony Planning Council, who not only is a planner, but also has an engineering background. And we're very pleased that she's agreed to be the moderator this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. It's a pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. So my name is Joanne Zygmunt. I'm the senior planner at Old Colony Planning Council, focused specifically on environment and economic development. OCPC, in case you haven't heard of us, we're a regional nonprofit planning agency. We help cities and towns in the greater Plymouth County area plan for the present and the future needs of their communities. So for example, over the past couple of years, we helped the town of Plymouth with their municipal vulnerability planning process. Some of you may have actually participated in some of the public surveys and workshops that took place. Through that project, we heard a lot about flooding issues in Plymouth. And in fact, most, if not all of our communities across the region are worried about the same thing. There are about 23,000 properties in Plymouth County that have a greater than 25% chance of being severely affected by flooding over the next 30 years. In addition to property damage, flooding can also cut off access to utilities, emergency services, transportation, and it could impact the overall economic well-being of the community. There can also be significant public health impacts both during and after flooding events. So this evening's message is that flooding is likely to impact day-to-day life within our communities, but there are many things that can be done at both the community level as well as at the household level to help prevent flooding and also to help minimize its impact. We've got a great lineup of experts with us here this evening who are going to help us unpack that message. So first we'll hear from Zach Zobel about the science behind the growing concern over our changing climate. Zach has a bachelor's degree in atmospheric sciences from Purdue and a master's and PhD from the University of Illinois. He specializes in climate risk at Woodwell, formerly known as Woods Hole Research Center, where he works with the investment community and municipal leaders on incorporating climate risk into decision-making. We'll then hear from David Gould, who will tell us about water in Plymouth. David is the director for the town of Plymouth's Department of Marine and Environmental Affairs. For over 20 years, he's been working on programs and projects to improve ecosystems and infrastructure in town. These range from endangered shorebird management and aquaculture, all the way through to dam removals and wetland restoration projects. He managed the restoration projects at Eel River Headwaters, Wellingsley Brook, Foothills, and projects along Town Brook. He has degrees from Bridgewater State University and Arizona State University, and has received several awards for his leadership and work, including the Coastal America Spirit Award, the Coastal America Partnership Award, and the NOAA, or some refer to it as NOAA, Environmental Hero Award. Next, we'll hear from Jonathan, also known as JB Better, who will tell us about how the town manages stormwater and what we can do about it as individuals. JB has been the director of the town's Department of Public Works for more than a decade. He studied construction management at Wentworth Institute of Technology and received his master's in public administration from Bridgewater State University. A few years ago, Plymouth experienced a pretty catastrophic sewer force main failure, but was able to respond successfully to that. JB was recognized for his leadership with an American Public Works Association Exceptional Performance Award in the category of adversity. And last, but of course not least, we'll hear from Joe Flood Rossi about the risk of flooding to homeowners and specifically about how flood insurance may be needed for some folks. Joe is president and CEO of Joe Flood Insurance Brokerage, as well as chair and executive director of the Massachusetts Coastal Coalition. He founded the Coastal Coalition in 2012. It's a nonprofit that educates, advocates, and informs folks about flood hazards. He's a member of the Flood Insurance Producers National Committee, which works with federal government to implement the National Flood Insurance Program. And he's also on the Massachusetts Community Rating System Committee and on the Massachusetts Association of Floodplain Management's Board of Directors. A busy man. He graduated from Wentworth Institute of Technology with a bachelor's degree in architecture. So I want to thank the panelists again this evening for joining us. And with that, Zach, I'm going to turn it over to you to kick us off. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. There we go. Good evening. As Joanne mentioned, I'm going to be talking to everybody today about the inland flood risk on municipalities and specifically what our group at Woodwell is working on. To begin, though, I wanted to give a background about the Woodwell Climate Research Center for those of you who may not have heard of us. It's located in Falmouth, and as Joanne mentioned, until last year, we were known as the Woods Hole Research Center. It was founded in the 1980s by Dr. George Woodwell, who was actually one of the first scientists to testify in front of Congress in the 1980s, speaking to the potential risk that climate will pose on all municipalities around the country. In 2007, our then president, John Holdren, spent 8 years in the Obama administration as the chief science advisor before retiring there afterwards. After his retirement, Dr. Phil Duffy is our current acting president, although at the time he is on a one-year loan to the Biden administration. So we have a long history of having scientists that really focus on making policy changes and policy differences. And that leads into a lot of what our work is working on. So fundamentally, climate change is no longer a future problem. It's no longer a problem affecting the faraway countries, and it's no longer a problem for our children. It's impacting us now, and we need to start adapting to the already changing climate. There's definitely the mitigation side of climate change, but we're past the time where there won't be any adapting needed. And that specifically is important when we start to think about the changing flood risk that climate change is imposing on our local communities. Just as of the last several years, I've highlighted several key projects in major municipalities around the country. These are all projects that have spent on the order of billions of dollars to try to combat the ever-changing flood risk of these local regions. The problem with this is that there isn't a set standard for how climate change should be incorporated when doing these very expensive upgrades. For example, in New Orleans, the levee that broke during Hurricane Katrina in 2005 was just recently completed in 2018. Within the next 3 to 4 years, however, because the climate has already changed so significantly in this part of the country, it will no longer provide adequate protection for a similar storm in the future. Boston and New York, however, are thinking about climate change when they're doing the infrastructure upgrades. So there's really a mismatch around the country on who's incorporating climate risk into their local flood risk management. That's where our group steps in. As part of a new project over the past year, we have been providing climate risk intelligence in general, not just flood risk, to several municipalities around the world. Our goal here is to get climate risk data into the hands of actual decision makers and local leaders so that they can use that information to start to adapt to the increasing risk. Here's the list of all the municipalities we've worked with so far. Our goal with this is not to pick out the Bostons and the New York cities. It's to find communities that may be under-resourced or may not have access to climate risk intelligence like a richer city such as New York or Boston might. So as you can see, many of the municipalities in the United States and around the world that we've worked with are lesser known cities. And that's really an important key to what we do at the Woodwell Climate Research Center. We believe climate intelligence shouldn't just be for the richest or the biggest communities, and that everybody needs to be planning for the increasing risk associated with climate change. As I mentioned, we actually do a full range of different climate risk variables. And I've shown here to highlight what I mean when I talk about climate risk. As the globe warms, the climate is being impacted in several different ways, whether it be from heat extremes or drought or wildfire to the water side of things with storm surge and precipitation extremes, and then eventually flooding. And flooding is what I'm going to focus on today per the panel being specifically targeted at flooding. The flood model that we run in-house at the Woodwell Climate Research Center incorporates a lot of different observations, climate model data that we can then simulate at very high resolution on the order of just a couple meters to get really a street level view of flood risk in a bunch of and on the municipalities that we work with around the country and the world. This flood risk model ingests data such as elevation, rainfall, stream flow, infiltration rate, which is how fast the soil can absorb water, land friction, and as well as storm surge for coastal locations. Once this is ingested, it works with a storm water model that can pinpoint areas in the storm water system that may be overwhelmed in a big rainfall event or flooding event. And now I'm going to show you a few examples of what we've been able to provide for some of the other municipalities with 3 United States specific examples. Here's what a flood model more or less looks like in real time. As you run throughout a 24-hour flooding event, we can capture the depth change in one of the municipalities we worked with out in New York named New Paltz. We found that New Paltz was uniquely, not uniquely, but New Paltz had a very high exposure to flood risk. And we were able to work with their local municipality leaders on where targeted flood defense systems could be set up to actually diminish the amount of flood risk that is taking place in the downtown area. Specifically, we found that their water treatment plant would be one of the first things to flood in a 1 in 100-year flood event. Here's some of the information we were able to provide to them. Not only are we showing that the flood extent is increasing under climate change in just the next 30 years, we were able to show that there would be a pretty rapid increase in the depth at which the flood would take place. We found that just by 2050, a 1 in 100-year flooding event due to increasing precipitation in a warmer atmosphere would actually increase the flood depth by almost a half a foot in just a 30-year period. We found that a 1 in 500-year event would be almost as much as a foot. But when you start to think about infrastructure, you really need to plan even further than the 30-year time frame. So we did look at what a flood event would look like in 2071 to 2090, and we found that there were even further increases in the amount of flood depth that would take place over most of the western half of the city. Another example of a municipality we worked with that's more coastal than inland, but had a good amount of inland flooding was in Chelsea, Massachusetts. I'm using Chelsea, Massachusetts here as an example of why FEMA flood maps have notoriously not been trusted by specifically the local leaders in these municipalities, but in the general science community at large. The map I have here on the right shows the FEMA flood zone, which I have here in blue, or a turquoise. The darker blue is where both FEMA and our Woodwell model picked up as a floodplain. And then the red obviously is where just our flood model noticed that there was a exposure to flood risk, but not being captured by FEMA. There are several aspects of the FEMA model when you start to break it down that actually don't provide real world accuracies. For example, they do not run a hydrodynamic model like we do, and countless science studies have shown that in order to really get a high resolution view of flood risk, you need to have a 2D hydrodynamic model. They run a simple 1D model and therefore are probably going to overestimate on some coastal locations, but then they're gonna miss the mark on a lot of the precipitation flooding. And that's what we see here in Chelsea, Massachusetts. The red areas here are mostly from precipitation pooling, or what a lot of people refer to as inland flooding. And they come, and the reason why the FEMA flood model doesn't pick up on those locations is because FEMA doesn't actually incorporate precipitation in their model at all. They have chosen to run the model without precipitation. So there's there on its face, we found that there's going to be a good amount of flooding that's missed, especially in inland locations like Plymouth County. And because both the ocean is rising and rainfall is increasing in intensity, we found that there were some joint probabilities that were really increasing to the point where these 1 in 100-year events from historical times, that 1 in 100-year event only has about a 1% chance of occurring each year if the statistics stay the same, in the future have a likelihood of occurring once every 34 years or once every 28 years. That still seems like a long time in between these events occurring. But when you start to think about a housing mortgage or an infrastructure being built that is meant to last for 40 to 50 years at a given location, that actually is a very high likelihood of occurring. And if you fall within this 1 in 100-year floodplain, you really have to adapt to this changing flood risk, meaning you have to build flood defenses of some kind to protect the assets that would be within this floodplain. Here's another example of a Midwestern city of Decorah, Iowa, where we were actually able to take a kind of a 2D view here and look at their levee system within their city. And we were able to pinpoint the specific vulnerabilities that they would have in these specific areas within the levee, in this case, that they would need to upgrade to keep protection. And we were even able to get down to the street level, which street needed the specific attention from the municipality leaders. They found this view actually very helpful, even more helpful than some of the maps, because they were able to go in and adjust the levee height so that it would protect them against a 1 in 500-year flood event. And that's important because we also found that in Decorah, Iowa, like in Chelsea, Massachusetts, and some of the previous examples, that a 1 in a 500-year event would almost triple in likelihood by 2050 due to the influence of climate change on precipitation extremes and stream flow. So I just wanted to end the talk by saying, going back to the prompt of the panel tonight, and it's what can we do to make a difference? Truth be told, the best thing that we can do is make sure local leaders and decision makers are climate risk aware. They are aware of where there is flood risk within their communities, and they are aware of what adaptive measures need to be taken as precipitation extremes continue to increase for inland locations and as storm surge continues to go up on the coastal locations. The work we've done that I've presented here with each of these municipalities is philanthropically funded. Therefore, it does not cost a town to sign up to work with us and to get flood risk aware. And it's a really good opportunity to, I think, pinpoint areas of adaptation that can be taken to avoid some of the worst consequences of climate change. So on that note, I'll pause and take any questions.
Thank you, Zach. I think it's so far right with you. We'll keep the questions to the end after all the presenters.
Sure.
Okay, super. Thanks, Zach. All right, so with that, we're now going to go over to David Gould. David, are you there?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me tonight.
Awesome.
Let me pull up the presentation here. All right, so this is kind of an interesting presentation to give. Oftentimes what we're talking about in Plymouth is coastal flooding. And I think this is an interesting topic as we've, in the last 10 or 15 years, had our fair share of inland flooding events, which is the focus of this presentation. So a little bit different, but certainly a timely presentation for sure. In Plymouth, as most of you all know, we have over 300 ponds and dozens of streams. So the opportunity and the likelihood of an inland flooding event is always present. Many of these coastal plain ponds that we do have are indicative of the groundwater heights. So when we have some of our most major inland flooding events, they're due to extremely high groundwater. And that has ramifications for what, if anything, can be done about some of those individual ponds when they do flood. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. One of the advantages Plymouth does have is we have a lot of sand and gravel, so excellent soil conditions for infiltration. So we have the opportunity to get a lot of rainfall or snow melt or rainfall and snow melt into the ground to prevent flooding. But some of our challenges as Plymouth continues to grow are the increase in urbanization in our village centers, as well as increases in impervious pavement. And then, of course, the climate change aspects of more frequent and intense rainfall events and increasingly warmer temperatures. So some of those impacts can be flooding from roadways and houses, but also impacts to fish and wildlife, aesthetics. And aesthetics can be things like increased flooding, warmer temperatures, public health. Those can be some of the cyanobacteria blooms that we've been having. So warmer temperatures, more stagnant water, can lead to some of those issues as well. I found this statistic to be very interesting. So this is from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and what it refers to is that since from 1958 to 2010, there's been a 71% increase in the amount of precipitation that fell on the heaviest precipitation days in that time period. Many of our drainage systems, bridges, culverts were designed using much more outdated precipitation estimates. So we have increasing rainfall events with infrastructure that was never intended or designed to handle that. And so obviously that's a conflict, and we'll speak a little bit more about that as we go along. So one of the things we oftentimes look at, not only in flood events, is the impacts to people and properties, but also to the environment. And so one of the things we look at is impervious area. And there's this interesting statistic, which is 10 to 20% of a watershed. When it becomes impervious, the runoff doubles in quantity, speed, and the pollutant load. So that so-called first flush that gets washed into the stormwater system, and then if it discharges into our lakes, ponds, or rivers, that's a significant impact. Some of the things that can help to diminish, other than the soil conditions, which Plymouth has, which I previously mentioned, we also have forested areas, pocket parks. You'll see a lot of bioretention or rain gardens scattered around town. Those are all beneficial to storing and slowing down the impact of rainfall events and snow melt. And there's even a couple of instances in which the use of pervious pavement, where practical can actually help and reduce some of that flood volume to some of our areas that we're concerned with. So folks will probably know this area. This is out in West Plymouth. This is Federal Furnace, and this is an area that tends to flood out during rainfall events, but it's also an area back in 2009 also experienced some flooding over the roadway from some of the coastal plain ponds that flooded due to extreme rainfall events, but also very high groundwater in March of 2009. And so these are some of the conditions that you'll see. Obviously, environmental conditions with all that runoff going into water bodies, but also driving conditions. And you can see the proximity to people's yards, into their garages, into their homes. If you have a sump pump, this is not what you want to be seeing. So a fair amount of impact from these kind of events. This is a recent photograph of the pathway from Willard Place to Newfield Street. And this is a path that was done as part of the Holmes project. The Holmes Dam project was done a few years back, and all of the sidewalks and paths are ADA compliant, but they're also impervious pavement. So that's an opportunity for runoff to go into the lawn areas that you see on the sides, but also go right through that paved surface, because it has large interstitial voids that allow that rainfall to go right through it rather than run off. So there are things that can be done in the right situations to help prevent and lower some of that runoff that you see during rainfall events. I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about some of the infrastructure. And most folks know we've done quite a bit of work with dams. And one of the common misperceptions is dams in the Northeast actually provide flood control. That's almost never the case. It's almost that they typically exacerbate flooding issues. So if you were to have a dam and it was to serve as a flood control, you would go in before the rainfall event and let water out, put all the boards back in, create plenty of freeboard and capacity, and then that would fill up and then slowly discharge over your spillway structure. That is almost never done. Oftentimes these structures are very small and never managed that way. So oftentimes what you have is this large bathtub that's already full of water, and then you have more water coming towards it, which puts a lot of pressure on these older structures. And then oftentimes we'll find a way to flood around rather than through the spillway. So we've done quite a few dam removals, mostly for ecological purposes, but they do also lower flooding events and restores a floodplain. Floodplain being a wonderful opportunity for storing stormwater throughout a watershed and slowly releasing it over time rather than having it all run off at once. So we have several projects in town that we'll be working on going forward. As dam repairs are necessary to bring those up to dam safety standards. And also at the same time, try to accommodate climate changes. Oftentimes, these structures, again, are very old and were never designed to handle these flood events and the kind of rainfall events we get now. So we're going back and retrofitting many of them. So when it comes to dam safety, we will continue to seek out those dam removal opportunities that provide both ecological benefits, but also flood control issues. And then dam repairs as necessary, like some of the ones we've done on the Russell Dam out in North Plymouth, the ones we've been working on in terms of design and permitting at Jenny, and then also Store Pond, which is located out near Portage Park, which is going to be a future project. This is part of a photograph showing some of the recent repair work to the dam out in North Plymouth. And so what it shows is a construction of a cutoff wall with a riprap on the downstream slope. And what will be the crest of the dam will be a paved roadway, which will look like that. So essentially what would happen during the course of a overtopping of the structure, because the spillway is of limited capacity, is that the pond would rise, flood over the riprap, not be able to erode the structure of the dam because of the cutoff walls, would force that water over the crest of the dam itself and to the downstream slope. So it would overtop without structural integrity of the dam being lost. And these are the kind of things we need to do to some of our older dams to ensure that they can handle those kind of storm events going forward. In regards to Jenny Pond Dam, we're looking to dredge the impoundment and create additional storage capacity, as well as make repairs to the dam itself. And because that spillway is like many of the spillways, it's very small and not able to pass new larger storm flows, we're looking to create a bypass channel. Now that bypass channel also has pretty wonderful ecological benefits for upstream and downstream fish passage, but it also will allow storm flows to pass through that bypass channel that can't be accommodated through the existing spillway. This is a photo from a few years ago. This is actually in July, when we typically don't see these kind of rainfall events, but we got about 7 inches of rain in about a 3-hour period early one July morning. And you can see how quickly Jenny Pond Dam got to Spring Lane, which is the crest of the dam. And then this is downstream. For those of you familiar, on the left in the foreground is actually the fish ladder completely overtopped with water. At the end of that concrete wall is actually a weir downstream, which is completely covered by the flood waters that overtopped it. So you can see how quickly these flood waters with a dam, which most folks will think of as being able to lessen flood events, is actually causing significant issues. The other infrastructure issue that we have been working on for quite some time are culverts and bridges. So we have a list over to the left of projects that we've been working on for many years, either culverts or bridges. Sometimes our bridges are contiguous with dams, and we're making those much larger to pass larger storm events. We design those for newer rainfall, oftentimes with a HEC-RAS model and in a H&H model, to make sure that we're designing those for the flood events that we're going to be seeing not only now, but those in the future. So you'll see those rather large culverts and bridges that we put in, but those are, that's intended to accommodate future flooding events. One of the other issues that we often see with culverts are that years ago they were designed properly, but now they're undersized. And from an ecological standpoint, which is again something that Marine Environmental Affairs is very concerned with, is that those undersized culverts cause a lot of flow volume through a small culvert and increases the velocity, which then can erode the downstream side. You can see those fish that are then, that the culvert then becomes perched, and those fish are stuck on the downstream side, unable to pass through that culvert. So when a culvert is properly sized, it can not only handle the flood events that happen in the future, but those are also the best for wildlife. Talk a little bit about some of the storage capacity and some of the wetlands work that we've done. Obviously, the driver for much of our wetland restoration work has been ecological habitat improvements, but there's also a great deal of storage capacity and wetland functions that are provided when we do these projects. So some folks will know the work that we've done at Eel River and Tidmarsh and out Foothills. And what those can do is they can store flood waters and slowly release them over time, rather than having all of that rainfall event come down at one time. And as in the case of Town Brook, what that can often lead to is what we call a LOMAR, or a letter of map revision, where we actually are able to document that those flood elevations have actually gone down. And what that can hopefully do for a lot of folks is take them out of floodplains and not require them to have the necessary insurance, which is obviously cost savings. One of the things we also like to do, and we've had a lot of support from lots of groups in town, Community Preservation, Open Space Committee, is that we like to acquire open space along our ponds and rivers, and that allows for protection of the floodplain, which allows for storage and dissipation of floodwaters, which is critically important to keeping flooding to a minimum. Just real briefly about some of the over 300 ponds that we have. Surface water elevations will increase, as you all know, when it floods. And back in 2009, we had a lot of requests to come out and lower water levels in ponds. Oftentimes, folks think that there is some sort of water control structure that will that we can alter and then drain some of the water out. That is true in a few cases, but the vast majority of our ponds do not have any sort of control structure. And even when they do, we need to be very careful about where that water is being sent. So we're not just making a problem better at one location to send the problem down to another neighborhood or another roadway or another critical area. Oftentimes, moving surface water doesn't actually solve the problem, because again, many of our coastal plain ponds are indicative of the groundwater. So you're moving surface water off, and it's very quickly being filled in with groundwater. Even if you could do it, there's substantial permitting and downstream consequences to doing such activities. So we need to be very cognizant of that. And very briefly, some of our future work that we're working on, as I mentioned, continued dam work, future dam removals where they become available. We will continue to do wetland restoration projects for flood control and prevention. Continuing to acquire open space, especially that open space around rivers and our ponds, is something very important to continue going forward. And then an increased emphasis, when we can, to develop rain gardens, use pervious pavement, tree plantings. Even some of these small things like buffers and pocket parks can be very important to reducing flooding event, especially in urbanized areas. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, David.
You're
All
very
right, over to JB. JB, you with us?
I sure am. Thank you, Joanne.
Hello.
Hello, everybody. So again, it's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the league, especially Evelyn, for having me this evening. The two previous speakers, Zach and David, both touched on a variety of topics that we're all aware of, and they both did a really good job. So I'm just going to follow up with that. I don't have a presentation, but I really do have a lot of ground to cover in terms of what the Plymouth DPW does. As everybody knows, we've been dealing with a tremendous change in the weather over the years, and that in tandem with sea level rise, it's kind of a rough combination for us here in Plymouth. But I will say our priority here, Public Works, and I know there's going to be multiple questions. I've already seen a couple, and we'll get into that when I'm done. I'll try and be as brief as possible so we can really get into some of that nitty gritty stuff. But for the DPW, it's more of following suit in terms of what Zach and David said in terms of upgrading your current systems, maintaining your current systems, operating those systems. But for us, really, it's most about, working with the planning board, zoning board of appeals, board of selectmen, and, all the boards and commissions and towns that are involved with these projects in terms of development, new development. It's our priority to make sure that there's proper mitigation to deal with the impacts to the town for a variety of reasons, not just to control future flooding, but to really protect our aquifer and to provide clean stormwater runoff. If you don't know this, developers, whether they be doing commercial industrial projects or residential subdivisions, they cannot increase post-development runoff. We require all those developments to basically size a 100-year storm. As Zach mentioned, we need to be in a position where all of the drainage here in Plymouth can handle 100-year storms. And sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but not too many of your inland systems have the ability to do that. When Plymouth really saw its building boom in the 70s and 80s, a lot of the developments don't have appropriately sized drainage. In the 2000s, we started to deal with NIPDs, National Pollutant and Discharge Elimination, where we had to really improve water quality. So we're doing that now. In all of our larger road reconstruction projects, we are installing drainage collection systems to handle those 100-year storms. But due to the topography and the complexity of Plymouth, a lot of times we don't have the ability to provide proper outflow. So we have to do what's called a series of leaching basins. And those, it's very difficult to appropriately size the drainage systems to combat and deal with those 100-year events. But what we do see, as David mentioned, we do see a series of inland flooding, but that's mostly due to rainfall intensity. And as you know, as I mentioned earlier, the frequency of those heavy storms are happening all the time. We see significant rainfall events multiple times per year. And, especially like this winter, when you have freeze-thaw cycles, heavy rain, you have a lot of flooding in low-lying areas, especially on your gravel roads. We have about 90 miles of gravel roads here in Plymouth. So that in tandem with frozen ground, extreme, rainfall, and inappropriately sized drainage, we experience flooding, and we're dealing with that. Last year, we put new drainage on Long Pond Road and Beaver Dam. We have drainage systems to go in at Hedge Road and Court Street. We have some larger sized drainage systems that need to go in. And following suit what David said, the bridges and the culverts, those are extremely important. But when we have, what we're seeing is when we have coastal storms, I know this is more of an inland discussion, but at the end of the day, it is all connected. We have 3 areas in town that are prone to coastal flooding. That's Water Street, Taylor Ave, and Warren Avenue. And when those areas back up due to tides or tidal surge, should I say, and high tides, astronomical high tides, that really sets up a really domino effect to inland areas where those ponds can outlet or outfall. And we have, I'll give an example to everybody. When we have, Plymouth Long Beach, the tides washes that brook and fills it in with sand, and that really backs upstream. That's when we see an inland flooding. And it's the same thing on Taylor Ave with Bartlett Brook, and even at Water Street, when that backs up. If we can't relieve those areas quick enough, we see, significant inland flooding. So that's an important issue for the DPW. Since I've been here in 2011, we've really kind of been very, proactive, and we do as much preventative maintenance in those areas as possible. But that becomes a permanent issue for us to kind of dredge those areas and clean those areas. The other important aspect of all of this is funding for these projects. When you look at drainage, we have issues up on Manamet Ave, Strand Ave with wicking wells and erosion on the bluff. Those are expensive systems, and we go to town meeting, and there's only so many dollars, in the fiscal year where we can go towards some of these drainage projects. I definitely would recommend that there's more attention placed on flooding in areas that are prone to prone to impacts, especially on homes and those residential areas during heavy rain events and when you have the backup. But like I mentioned, working with the zoning board of appeals, the planning board, and some of these bigger projects, it's important that we're fully aware of what those impacts are and those reviews, and that they meet our minimum standards. But the DPW we do annually submit our stormwater permit, and that's a federal permit. And we do clean every catch basin. We do sweep your streets because it is important. David mentioned that first flush for us. Any of those contaminants, when you get a heavy rainfall event, are getting into your ponds. So it's important for us to keep roadways clean, your catch basins clean. So all of those things are happening now, and they will continue to happen. But I will say this is a great topic. It's an important conversation. I know the municipal vulnerability plan, that's something we all collectively need to work on and continue to work on, and that needs to be a priority. But there's so many areas in Plymouth that do not have any drainage systems. And it's very expensive. And we are a little bit different than most of the communities in the Commonwealth, where we have over 400 miles of roadway in Plymouth, and those areas that don't have drainage, those are the areas that flood, during those high intense storms. And there's a lot of low-lying neighborhoods that are actually lower than ground level. And those are the ones that are also those are areas we also have to deal with. Again, this winter, it's a seasonal thing. It doesn't happen every year, as David mentioned, 2009, 2011, 2018, and then again this year. Those are the years, since I've been around, that we've had significant flooding. And those are the areas we learn, and those are the areas that we, understand better once we see it visually, and we just, continually need to work on addressing those issues. So with that, for us, it's a constant and dedicated program that the DPW has. We're always doing drainage projects. We're always, working with those boards and committees to make sure that the appropriately sized drainage systems are in there. And then, it's just day-to-day maintenance and addressing, the needs of the town. And I will say, we're not alone in the world of public works in terms of dealing with, antiquated and, inadequate drainage. It's something that we need to pay attention to and always and constantly upgrade. And it's something that we have to be ready for in terms of a response to deal with flooding. Undersized culverts, as David mentioned, we have those throughout town, old, smaller sized bridges. Brook Road is a great example of an area that, most likely someday will flood. And, we've been to town meeting a couple times on a project like that. And the goal is to appropriately size that crossing so it can deal with stormwater. So those are the issues that, the DPW brings to the table day in and day out. And, we are fully aware of the impacts that people are experiencing. And I'm just happy to answer any questions. And this has been a very good topic this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, JB. So before we go on to questions, we're going to hear from our last speaker, Joe Flood Rossi. But before we do that, I just want to remind folks that if you do have any questions, please put them into the Q&A box that you should see a button for on your screen. There's also a chat as well, possibly, I think, that you can see, so you can put them in there too. And we'll go through them after we hear from Joe. So Joe, it's over to you.
Great, thank you very much. One moment while I work to share my screen. Okay, great. All right, great. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Joe Rossi, also known as Joe Flood. And tonight, that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about, which is flood risk, how it relates to flood insurance. So understanding risk protection and vulnerabilities. Okay, so really I wanted to start off with how all of this, how we're going to tie everything together from flood insurance to flood mapping and floodplain management. And we've heard from some speakers already that have touched on a little bit of everything except the insurance piece, but it is all related. Because the National Flood Insurance Program, which most people know as its insurance elements, right? NFIP insurance, they're the National Flood Insurance Program. Well, it actually has several legs to the stool. So it's not just insurance. And for a community to, or for an individual to purchase flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program, a community must participate in the NFIP. So of 26,000 communities nationwide, 22,000 participate. It's a voluntary program. Plymouth has participated since 1986. There are 11 communities in Massachusetts that don't. Don't ask me exactly which ones, but I will tell you the most recent and closest to us is Rockland. And you'll see that, there's really three legs to the NFIP stool, right? The flood insurance aspect, as I noted, is the most well-known, but floodplain management and flood mapping also tie into the insurance program. So the NFIP, flood mapping identifies the risk, establishes high and low risk flood zones. Now with the new rating system I'll talk about in a moment, there are some elements used for insurance purposes, and the flood zone set the standards for floodplain mitigation and building standards. Flood insurance, obviously, premiums inform risk. Financial resilience is based on those that purchase flood insurance. There are opportunities to increase mitigation activity, right? The higher you go, the less the flood insurance. And grants are made available through the insurance program. And then there's the floodplain management program. Because of the standards that the National Flood Insurance Program sets forth, there's about $2 billion nationally a year avoided in flood losses. You can both structurally and non-structurally mitigate. In floodplain management, obviously, like I mentioned with the insurance piece, the more you mitigate, the lower the insurance rates. Well, how does the National Flood Insurance Program and other insurance programs, how do we measure risk and how do we prepare for the changing risks in our environment? Well, I think the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program, has really put their foot out there and made some huge changes just this year. In fact, we're about to enter the final phase, April 1st, of the change in rating called Risk Rating 2.0. Right. The idea is that we scrap the old rating program with the National Flood Insurance Program and have a new program that is a total redesign of the rating structure that is based on a graduated rating and risk system versus a binary. So rather than being in an A zone or a V zone and having a general rate or an estimate of premium based on zone, every single building has a very specific risk and is rated to that specific risk. Closer you are to a water source, the higher the premium in theory, and there's other variables, and here are the variables, right? So in the legacy system, there were some pretty basic things that you took into consideration to get insurance premium through the NFIP. Base flood elevation, flood mapping, 1% annual chance of flooding, which are those shaded blue zones on the maps. Now under risk rating 2.0, there's a ton of different variables. There's different types of flood types that FEMA is calculating: stream size and order, ground elevation, construction type, the cost to rebuild the buildings. All these things were not considered in the legacy system. All of them set the NFIP up to be able to estimate risk a lot better now and going forward. So again, flood mapping, right? Flood changes. We've heard a lot about flood mapping. Well, flood maps change. And in Plymouth, there's been revisions in 92, 06, 2012, 2016, and now most recently in 2021. And, based on whether you're in a low or high risk flood zone, well, it doesn't really matter whether you're in a low or high risk flood zone. Flood insurance with risk rating 2.0 now no longer just drops in cost because you're in a low risk flood zone. Really, in a low risk flood zone, It's any area that's not shaded. Floodplain management requirements are not required in these places, but risk rating 2.0 rewards those who mitigate in those areas now, so lower flood premiums. Flood insurance may no longer be low. So mapped low risk does not mean low rate. That is gone under risk rating 2.0. Lenders may not require insurance there, but again, low risk does not mean no risk. 40% of flood losses come from these non-shaded low risk areas. High risk areas, obviously, there's an identified high risk it's called the SFHA. So these areas are where flood insurance is required with a federally backed mortgage, and these are the areas where the community is going to enforce their floodplain management standards. So for those of you that got a letter recently saying you may have been moved into the high risk flood zone under the map change in Plymouth, you can buy flood insurance now, and in fact, it's encouraged. Those that purchase flood insurance within 12 months of a map change, and that date would be 7/6 of this year in Plymouth, can receive a 30% discount on their flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program. However, we used to tell you to go buy the preferred risk policy. That is no longer the case because of risk rating 2.0, but you can receive a discount, buy your flood insurance if you were newly mapped on or before 7/6 of this year. And of course, there's other ways to measure flood risk, not just through the National Flood Insurance Program's risk rating 2.0. NOAA has a tool, First Street Foundation has a tool, Massachusetts has a tool. There's all these links here. You can go and find your flood risk. But from an insurance standpoint, right, we don't use any of these tools. These are great informational tools to understand your risk by going online. But when we at Joe Flood Insurance, for example, when we rate a flood insurance policy that is available through the private flood insurance programs, we look at a couple different rating factors and modeling. So here's your basic location, right? You have this one happens to be in Florida, but it still makes the point. We take a look at an aerial photo, then we overlay some riverine exposure. So this is now showing us that the darker colors are more severe than the lighter colors. So we know that there's a risk here. Now the red is the FEMA mapped layer. So you can see how much more risk is actually there versus what FEMA's mapping, right? There's purple shaded in this picture all over the place versus red, which is really more in the center. And you can see that our Chubb market, which is who we use to write our private flood, is scoring this at 55 out of 100. So we're actually saying, okay, we've got elevation information. We're looking at a risk score. This is how we're rating our insurance, not the NFIP. They're doing it through risk rating 2.0, but the private markets are really looking at more elements than probably any other insurance programs, because including homeowners, because of the immense risk that flood poses. So now, being financially resilient is really important. And the best way to do that against flooding is by purchasing flood insurance. Private markets exist, as I mentioned, so they're not federally backed. Private writes also above NFIP limits if you want to get more than what the NFIPs offer. So NFIP maxes out at 250. You can go up to infinite amounts or as high as your building's replacement costs through private flood. And they also have standalone private policies. You purchase it from your local insurance agent. It covers most items in the building. Each building has a unique premium. And disaster assistance will not make you whole. Do not wait on disaster assistance. You can see the numbers there during Hurricane Harvey. I think there's a stark comparison to what you would get from insurance versus disaster assistance. So this graphic, without going into detail here, really shows that when you purchase flood insurance, your recovery is a lot quicker, right? The red is an insurance purchase, where the gray is if somebody doesn't have an insurance purchase or insurance policy. The damage could be just as bad, but the recovery can be quicker. And that is the key. So when we look at a community, right, and this is a flood city, right, a made up community, and they have, 10,000 buildings, about 1,700 flood policies. The idea is that after the flood, what financial assistance becomes available to the community? Well, disaster assistance, well, like I said, that's not great. In Hurricane Harvey, it was about $6,000. And HMGP, well, it's pretty much limited after a storm, and you have to qualify, and it's a long process. The SBA up to $200,000 for primary homeowners. So again, not a great resource to rely on. Traditional lending obviously is there, but there's also certain requirements you have to meet. But your flood insurance policy is always there. And the idea here is in Flood City, that means that over $400 million in flood insurance is in force, and that community is going to recover a lot better collectively. So what can we do to protect ourselves and our communities? Well, the first is build higher than required. In Massachusetts, you're required to go 1 foot higher than the stated flood elevation on the map in an A zone and 2 feet higher than the stated flood elevation in a V zone. But if you want a better insurance premium with risk rating 2.0, just keep going up. There's no longer a cap on how high you can go. There's also local ordinances that can help in flood insurance premiums. And for example, in Marshfield, we have what we call a bump out ordinance, where if you want to move your machinery or mechanicals, say from a basement to a first floor, you're allowed a 32 square foot enclosure to put your furnace. So it encourages people to bring their furnace up or equipment to the next floor. And in Hull, there's a savings on your building permit if you go higher than the stated requirements. And there's also the community rating system. Plymouth is involved. Plymouth is a level 9 in CRS, so they get a 5% discount on all of their NFIP policies throughout the high-risk flood zone. A great way to get your community to save money on all NFIP flood insurance is CRS. So CRS enables a community to reduce the cost of flood insurance for all its citizens with an NFIP policy, provided the community performs certain tasks and risk reduction activities. So by the town doing certain things, the community's NFIP premiums go down. Again, Plymouth has a 5% discount currently. And of course, there's other ways to reduce risk. Have a personal emergency kit, know which disasters are more likely to strike, moving valuables out of basements, right? Those are some simple things. Securing or bringing inside outdoor items during a storm to prevent them from becoming debris, making sure basement sump pumps work, directing drainage away from homes, right? So really the next one is kind of tied into that, which is for communities to not allow an excessive amount of fill in floodplains. And we see this all too often, which again causes water to be directed towards properties inadvertently. And then communities purchasing open space is a phenomenal way. Marshfield, the community that I'm very involved in from the CRS perspective, purchases open space, which gets them CRS points. So again, the more the community's involved in CRS, which Plymouth is, the more purchasing of open space in high-risk flood zones, the more points you get for CRS. So, and it's a points-based system. So this is my contact information. I appreciate everybody being here tonight, and thank you for having me speak, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Joe. And we do have a few questions that have come in. Again, for folks joining us this evening, please use the chat button or the Q&A button on your screens to ask your questions. So I'm wondering in particular, we've got some questions about the FEMA maps. So there seems to be quite a few different maps and models out there. There's an audience member who would like to know how FEMA maps can be updated with new information. So I don't know, Joe, if you've got an answer for that, or maybe Zach.
Sure. I'll start anyways. FEMA updates maps periodically. It's supposed to be somewhere on like a 10-year cycle. Whether that happens or not exactly is a whole nother question. And yes, they're updated there's new information that FEMA uses. In fact, the new map process is supposed to take in developments in a community, changing climate or environments, and other items that could affect the floodplain. The problem is by the time those maps are published, the data is already old because it takes so long through the regulatory process to make those maps effective. Doesn't mean the maps are absolutely useless. They're great for floodplain management and other uses in the community. But again, that's why FEMA is moving more to risk rating 2.0, where the maps become a very small part of what the premiums are based on. They're now being based on models similar but not exact to what I showed that we use for our private flood insurance.
Thank you. Zach, do you have anything to add to that?
No, Joe hit it right on the head. That was spot on in my opinion. I will say that one of the biggest obstacles that FEMA faces at times is the lack of publicly available localized flood defenses. They do, when available, incorporate that in. We've found several gaps where that isn't the case, where that isn't being factored in effectively even in their new risk 2.0, which is a significant upgrade to the previous maps.
Thank you. So one of the audience members asked about how Plymouth could get Woodwell involved to do an analysis. And I'm going to pass it over to you, Zach, in a second to answer that question live for us. But before I do, JB, I'm wondering if you could talk about what tools the town uses to look at flood risk. So is it the FEMA maps, or is it something else, or is it a combination of?
Yeah, it's all of the above there. Most of it is, I will say that the DPW is reactive when it comes to flooding of that nature. And, once we're aware of a situation, that's when we really get in there and, upgrade, update and repair structures. Somebody asked a really good question in terms of our ability to respond to basically all the watersheds in Plymouth. And we don't, to properly implement and size those drainage systems, it would, it'd be a very expensive process, if you would. It's really not even feasible right now. I think it's just a question of slowly picking at it in terms of the most prone areas, those areas that have the greatest impact to, homeowners, landowners, and basically those things that are, really impact public safety in terms of motorists or pedestrians. I think that's how we look at things. But to answer the overall question, the way we address those is basically case by case based on a priority in terms of what areas are most significantly impacted.
Thanks, JB.
You're welcome.
And Zach, do you want to talk a little bit about how Woodwell could potentially be involved in Plymouth and what that kind of kickstart could look like?
So we just completed our pilot program, which included the bulk of the municipalities I showed globally. In fact, we are starting to branch out to more than just the United States as much as we can. With that being said, we always want to try to get municipalities in our own backyard. And we really don't have anything from Southern Massachusetts right now. I know our group, it would be eager to work with towns and municipalities across Southern Massachusetts. And it at times comes down to a motivation from the city management, getting on the phone with the right people, which I think we have some of those people on this call potentially, but getting on the phone with the right people, working out what could possibly be done. The one thing that we've been working on is not only where is the floodplain, but what can we do to potentially change how that floodplain is impacting the citizens. And I think that's really where our added value is the highest at this moment. For example, in Chelsea, Massachusetts, we advised a spillover zone in the form of a public park that we found once we incorporated that into the climate model with our best estimates on infiltration rates and changing from an impervious surface of a parking lot to a public park. We found that reduced certain neighborhoods' flood risk by twofold. So we work on not only where the floodplain is, but where the solutions might lie. And I think that's where our added value is. And a lot of times it comes down to an eagerness on the city's part to use the information we have.
Great, thank you very much. David, I'm going to pass this one over to you. So there's an audience member who's asking about Plymouth Long Beach. So Long Beach has experienced significant changes to the dunes over the last few years from severe storms. Are there any plans to shore up the critical barrier beach to prevent a permanent breach?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're currently working through a project right now, which is to do a large scale nourishment project just north of the day parking area up to the crossover. So folks familiar with Long Beach will be familiar with that location. We're in the process of finalizing the permitting on that, and then we'll start looking for some of the grant funding that's available for projects like that, like we've done with other projects on Long Beach. There was also in the last few years been an appropriation to Army Corps of Engineers, who actually owns the stone dike that runs the length of the beach, so that they are going through the design and permitting process, which is a little bit different than what they did in terms of design about 20 years ago. So they're not only looking at incorporating reconstruction of the stone dike in certain locations, but they too now are also looking at things like cobble nourishment or beach nourishment or a combination thereof. So there's actually a couple of projects in the design and permitting phase, and hopefully in the next few years, an appropriation for Army Corps to actually implement that. Now that project would be in the same location as the cobble nourishment project we're working on. And that's the area in which most folks believe that if the breach is going to breach, it would be in that location. So 2 projects that are currently underway to hopefully address that in the future.
Great, thank you, David.
You're welcome.
There's another question, and this might be maybe perhaps for a combination of you, David, as well as JB. So with changing conditions in high flood risk areas, whether built upon or not, can new development be limited or prohibited? That's kind of a, controversial one.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think to some degree, both JB and I sort of deal with the consequences of much of that development that's already been allowed to happen in those places. And so hopefully going forward, the various boards and committees in town will continue to limit those activities, because oftentimes what we're dealing with is dealing with things that have already happened in the past. And we really need to limit those going forward. I think Joe's comments about limiting fill in floodplains and preventing those things from happening in the first place is the key to making up some ground going forward if we can.
And the boards that you refer to, that's primarily the zoning board and the planning board?
Correct. As well as Conservation Commission.
And conservation. Great. JB, do you have anything to add to that?
I do. No, David hit the nail on the head, but I will say we all take a hard line at town hall as far as any project that may impact, drainage, especially, that ties into the municipal system, because we own it at the end of the day. And, if there's going to be an increase in impact, we're going to let everybody know that, and we will not support a project if that's the case. Like I said, we will not, allow any increase in post-development, and we want to make sure that it's properly treated and all those systems are adequately sized for a 100-year storm. And I will say that the boards and commissions have gotten really good over the years in supporting, our recommendations in that to that point.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
For David, I'm going to go back to you. So you talked a little bit about impervious surfaces. Joe did a great job talking about some of the specific things folks can do in their home to try and mitigate flooding, things like keeping their roofs drained properly, elevating, mechanical systems, stuff like that. Can you talk a little bit about, whether homeowners should consider removing impermeable surfaces, and if so, what their considerations should be?
So I think oftentimes, probably the most significant impact, other than the actual, dwelling on a personal property, is their driveway. And so looking at how much actual pavement impervious surface you need or want. Oftentimes runoff from the driveways goes right into the municipal roadway and into those catch basins and into that drainage. So obviously limiting those and increasing, the kind of plantings you put around their property can also have a big impact. I know from personal experience, I did quite a bit at that my own home, simply because I didn't want to mow all the lawn that existed when I bought it. So that, that reduces some of that work as well. But oftentimes those are very personal decisions you have to make on your own property. And you do have to think that oftentimes it does have an impact, especially when your driveway may be, draining right to a public roadway, which might be connected to a lake or a pond or a stream nearby that you weren't even aware of. So it's good to know your neighborhood and know where your yard and your roadway drains to, because the more you know about it, probably the more concerned and caring you'll be about it.
Thank you. JB, so you typed in the chat, and I'm not sure if folks can see this. I think it might just be panelists, but Plymouth has approximately 12,573 catch basins. That's a lot of catch basins for you guys to get to every year to keep clean. Do you encourage community members, householders, and businesses to sort of adopt a catch basin and try and help maintain those?
I wouldn't. Yeah, so that is a hell of a lot of catch basins in comparison to most, municipalities in Massachusetts. And it's very expensive to maintain all of those. But no, I wouldn't recommend a program to adopt. What I would ask and what we would, request always is that homeowners, make sure that they keep the debris, the grates clear of debris. That is probably the biggest nuisance for us, the biggest, cause of, street level flooding is when you have debris, mostly leaves, wash up onto the grate and do not promote, flow into the structure. So that would be a huge benefit. And that's our ask of homeowners, but be safe, in the roadway, especially if it's raining out. But yeah, to make sure those catch basins are properly cleaned out and maintained. And if they can't do it, get a hold of us, call us, email us, go on the town website, just let somebody know that, it needs to be maintained. Because again, Plymouth it's a huge town. We don't have eyes on every catch basin all the time. So if people could let us know or do that. But the question was asked, do we, maintain and upgrade our catch basins all the time? The answer is no. What we do is, we have a Vector truck and a clamshell truck that we put out seasonally to maintain and clean as many as we can. But every single time our road program goes into effect, we inspect all the catch basins. For example, we're paving Court Street in a couple of weeks, hopefully, the beginning, the end of April. All of those catch basins will be inspected. All of those drain lines will be CCTV'd. That's typical for all of our road projects. So every time we pave your streets, before we pave it, we're looking at the drainage system. Is there a broken pipe? Is there something undersized? Does a catch basin need to be replaced or maintained or purged or a new grate? Those happen annually. And that's very straightforward. The problem is when we need new systems on roadways that are to be repaved. It gets very expensive. You're looking at $1 million per mile of road to repave and install drainage collection. It's expensive. So that can only get us so far. So when we do pave, accepted and unaccepted roads, we are putting drainage in. So this town meeting in a couple of weeks, we have the Article 10, I think it's Article 10, which is road preservation at $5 million. That will fund accepted and unaccepted roads. And we use those dollars for those bigger road projects that need drainage systems. Those are where those funds are going. And over time, we'll get to some of the more problematic areas prone to flooding, especially inland. Thanks.
Thank you. And I just have one more question. So there is actually, Evelyn, this is for you. So there's a question about whether the presentation will be available online. I know that we are recording. Will there be recording and slides available afterwards?
So we had planned to post the recording on the League of Women Voters website, and I do have copies of most of the presentations that we could also post links to. So if people are interested, we certainly will do that as soon as we can after this is done this evening.
Great, thank you. And I just have one last question, again, probably for JB and or David. But there's a lot of money coming from federal government, sometimes through the state, sometimes directly for infrastructure as part of the American Rescue Act and other initiatives. There are a lot of competing priorities in a town like Plymouth, obviously. And I'm wondering whether you guys feel like those resources are coming your way for inland flooding, at least a little bit, or whether this is, an issue that community members really need to talk more to their elected officials about, both at the state and local level.
I'll jump in on that one. Good, David.
Yeah, so I think some of that funding is is something we're already working on for specific projects. The Jenny Gristmill bypass is one that we've been talking to some of our federal partners about and just waiting for some of those RFPs to be issued. And I think, that particular project suits some of those RFPs very well. There are others that I think will need to do work to get more information about, but I do think the town's in a good position with the climate resiliency person coming on board soon. And that person will have more funding availability for projects going forward than has been available in, well, probably ever, certainly in our lifetime. So having a person in that position who can go after some of that funding is going to be a really positive thing for the town of Plymouth.
I just want to jump in there and say, I think as far as I'm aware, in Old Colony's region, I think Plymouth is going to be the first town with a climate resiliency person. So that's super exciting. JB, do you have anything to add to that?
I do. Yeah, and I know we worked with OCPC and the EDA grant for Manament Pipe, which was fantastic. But yeah, we have qualified for opera funding in the millions of dollars already, and we've already, engaged in a variety of projects. One is the flood barrier wall around the Water Street pump station. CARES money. We are aware, and more information is coming out day to day on the Biden infrastructure bill. It's important that the town has shovel-ready projects. So, we are equipped with those. The Water Street Promenade, Hedge and Court Street Drain, and some smaller ones. But the issue that we're seeing is the exorbitant costs with the projects and scheduling and availability of materials. So all of this money is becoming available, but at the same time, there's significant delay and tremendous cost increases associated with these projects. So it's very difficult to manage them. For example, we're seeing a year lead time on 8-inch ductile iron. We're seeing, very competitive bid projects, in terms of 30 to 40% cost increases. So all of these things, are really coming together, making it difficult for a lot of, communities, across the country to get some of these projects done. And as the more money flows, it's going to continue to be competitive. So all I can say is that we have as many shovel-ready projects, on the books. As David mentioned, we have the new MVB planner, but we also have, Tiffany, our new grant writer, who's going to be working with all of your departments to get some of these projects moving forward in terms of grants. But we will keep on pushing, for all of them, especially with the Plymouth County CARES money.
Fantastic. Evelyn, I don't see any more questions in the Q&A or the chat, so I think it's back over to you.
Okay, thank you. And once again, thank you to all the panelists who participated. I wanted to say, I was going to mention the recording that was going to be posted on our website, partly because I hope that people will go to the League of Women's website. You can see it posted now on the screen, that there's an opportunity to learn more about this topic. The League has been working with the Municipal Vulnerability Project here in Plymouth, the Saltwater Intrusion Grant. We've developed a reading list. So if you go to our website, you can link to that a reading list that will give you books that can give you more information about this and about climate crisis in general. And so I would encourage you to do that. There are also some discussion questions. And while you're on our website, you might want to consider joining us. The League is open to everyone. It's maybe labeled the League of Women Voters, but it's certainly not limited to women. So we would welcome new members also. Finally, I just wanted to say that polling indicates that a vast majority of people believe that climate change is real. But I think we don't talk about it enough, and that hopefully that tonight's discussion is the beginning of a broader conversation, and one that will move us towards both individual and community action. So thank you again for being here. Stay healthy and safe, and good night.